So now we're going to consider our last objection to Locke's view. And in a way, it's the simplest objection, but probably also the most powerful objection. So the last two objections effectively were exercises in showing you that Locke maybe didn't state his theory in the best possible way. He stated it in terms of words meaning particular things for particular people, namely their ideas of something or other. We saw that we can sort of improve on that by instead using this type token idea and saying that words stand for types of ideas. But probably the strongest, so those are objections just to a particular version of the view. But Mill actually wants to make an objection, and it's kind of a fairly straightforward objection, to just this kind of theory in general. And his objection is just that, well, when you think about it, we don't really go around talking as if words mean ideas. They stand for the things themselves that we're talking about. So we can think about a particular example. So suppose I say, the cat is on the mat. What am I talking about there? Am I talking about an idea? Well, no, it seems like I'm talking about a particular fact that holds in the world, a particular cat's being on the mat. Or think about the mushroom example. When I say that mushroom is poisonous, am I talking about some ideas? Am I talking about something going on in my head, or something that's going on in all of our heads, or could be going on in all of our heads? Intuitively, the answer is no. I'm talking about a fact in the world, that a particular kind of mushroom, an object that exists in the world, has a particular kind of property, namely being poisonous. So Mill basically wants to say that, well, when you think about it, this idea of words standing for ideas doesn't really seem to actually hold up that well when we, even just ourselves, think about our intuitive ideas about meaning. Here's maybe one last way to bring this idea out. So I mentioned the example of pangolin earlier. So suppose you didn't know what that word was. And suppose you asked, well, what does the word pangolin mean? How would I answer that? Well, I would answer it by saying, well, it means a particular animal that lives in Asia, has certain kinds of features. To answer your question about what the word means, I would talk about the animal itself. I would describe the animal to you to help you get a sense of what kind of thing in the world that word stands for. I wouldn't say, oh, when you said, what does the word pangolin mean? I wouldn't say, oh, well, it means an idea of an animal that lives in Asia that has particular features. It would be really strange if I started talking about ideas in response to your question about what does the word mean. This just sort of suggests that we're just making some kind of confusion here about ideas and meanings. Really, it does sound tempting. The idea of meanings being ideas is kind of a tempting one when you think about it in the abstract. But when you pay close attention to how we actually talk about meanings, and when asked what the meaning of something is, the kinds of answers we give, we would never start talking about ideas. We would always start talking about the things in the world that intuitively these things stand for. But once you start talking about words standing for things in the world, rather than ideas in the head, then you've sort of given up the central idea of Locke's theory. Because the central idea was that, well, words stand for things, but they stand for ideas. And once we start instead saying that meanings stand for objects in the world, it kind of looks like we've given up this original idea. Again, this is an objection that Locke anticipates. Locke is a smart guy, these kinds of things would have occurred to him. But again, his reaction is not really, in my opinion, totally satisfying. What he says in the reading for today kind of wants to have it both ways. Because he says something like, well, I admit that in some sense there does seem to be a sense in which words stand for things in the world, but they also stand for ideas. So he wants to say that they stand for both of these things, that in some sense words both stand for ideas and they stand for things in the world. But I have to confess, I find this very difficult to make sense of. I don't really know exactly what Locke had in mind at this point. Because, if you think about, the word mushroom, it's not like, it doesn't seem intuitive to say that has two meanings. It just has one meaning. the thing in the world. It means mushrooms. It doesn't also mean my idea of a mushroom. That seems to be sort of, if you said it did, it seemed like you would be making some kind of mistake about the word mushroom. Likewise, if you take my name, David Boylan, I find it hard to make sense of the proposal that has two meanings, that it both means me and it also means an idea of me. Because, again, it seems like, insofar as we're focusing on a particular usage of the word, it kind of looks like it just has one meaning. It's not really clear why would we really get to say two. The further question is also that once you have admitted that words stand for objects in the world, there is a question of what is even the point anymore of saying that they also stand for ideas? Why would saying that words stand for objects, why wouldn't that be enough? Why isn't that enough to explain what meaning is? Why would we have to have both of these elements? And this is something that, as far as I can see, Locke doesn't really explain for us. So we saw three objections to Locke's theory. One was the objection about how the theory actually explains sharing thoughts. The second was the objection about whether it can explain shared languages. And the final objection is this sort of more flat-footed one about maybe there's just a mistake in saying that objects stand for ideas rather than things in the world. As we said, the first two are more questions of detail. I think if you only had the first two objections, maybe this theory would be workable. But to my mind, the third objection, which admittedly does just sort of mostly rest on intuition, it does seem to get at something I think really problematic about the theory. It's not the case, because if you just think about, when we go around saying things, we're not talking about our ideas, we're talking about facts in the world. But it would look like Locke's theory, because he says that words stand for ideas, that the meaning of a word is an idea, it would appear that the theory has the consequence that when I say that mushroom is poisonous, I'm talking about the idea that the mushroom is poisonous or something like that, rather than the fact itself. And that looks wrong, because intuitively, I am talking about the fact itself, something that's going on in the world, and not something that's going on in my head. But I want to emphasize that even if the theory Locke gave was not correct, the thought he started with is clearly a very important one. His thought was, the main function of language is to share thoughts with each other. The purpose of having a language is for me to have a thought which I can then communicate to you. And something that's going to be worth you guys keeping in mind is, maybe Locke's attempt at explaining that didn't go so well. But it is clearly something that language does. He was clearly right that is language. That is something that's very important to explain in giving a theory of language. So I want to encourage you guys to keep that idea in mind as we go through. So this is obviously one purpose of language. And something we have to explain on any theory of meaning is how it's supposed to work. How are we able to share thoughts on this particular theory of meaning? So that's all we're going to say about Locke today. In the next video, we're going to move on to start thinking about the Mill excerpt that you read.